welcome to this presentation on full cost recovery, what it is, why it's important and how we do it. I'm really pleased to be working with Mairead O'Rourke, who I've worked with since I think 2008.
2007, but I'm not counting.
2007 is it? Wow. Okay, only 15 years we've known each other. Back when we both worked for Museums, Libraries and Archives, London region. So if you're expecting a presentation on full cost recovery, you're in the right place. So firstly, a little bit about us. I'm Richard Sved. I've worked in the charity sector for over 25 years, shockingly. So all of my working life, and I've been a volunteer before that. So really 30 odd years in the charity sector. I've run the fundraising for 8 national charities now, both in-house and as an interim. And not surprisingly, my fundraising experience now covers all areas of fundraising, but particularly relevant to this session, that's fundraising from grant makers, National Lottery Community Fund, National Lottery Heritage Fund, and statutory funders. I mentioned that I've been a volunteer even before I was a charity sector employee. Goes back to my school days, and I've been a trustee for the last 10 years or so, including currently I'm a trustee of the St Albans Museums and Galleries Trust. I mentioned that I've got my experience with Museums, Libraries and Archives London region. I've since also worked in the heritage sector on a number of occasions, including training in the Hampshire region. I think one or two of you who are here I've recognised from training previously. I'm a freelance consultant and an interim manager, and that's me.
Thank you, Richard. And yeah, I'm also seeing a few familiar faces. I think, Kevin, I recognise you from coming along, am I right? And so I'm Mairead. It's pronounced like parade, but with an M. But I don't mind if you get it wrong. I have about 15 plus, it's probably coming closer to 20 years now, working in the arts and heritage sector. Most of my work is around organisational resilience. I do a lot of board and governance work. And my previous experience includes working at the Arts Council as Senior Officer, Organisational Development, and at the National Archives. I was also previously a Museum Development Officer, where I had the joy of working with Kate and Elaine in London and in the South East. So I'm familiar with the region. I've also been a volunteer. I've done many volunteering roles, but I've been a trustee at 2 museums, at the Charles Dickens Museum in London and Chiltern Open Air Museum near where I live now in the Chilterns. But I also have 2 small children, a 4-year-old and a 6-month-old, who I'm hoping won't interrupt us today. And they took up more of my time than I could give in a trustee role. And after having my son in 2015, I set up Culture Runner to focus what I was doing in terms of supporting organisations in organisational reviews and governance.
There'll be time for your questions, but as there's not so many of us, we took the decision this morning that we would go back to the floor more regularly during the presentation, so there'll be chances for you to actually contribute as if we had a flip chart here in the room. So I will be taking the presentation down and actually typing into it while you're talking.
Sorry, Richard, can people use the chat box as we're going along to put their questions in?
Yeah, I think, can you see the chat box? If you can't see it, yeah, there's a button that says chat. It appears in different places on lots of people's screens. Mine's top right, but I think it depends on your device. You can type in there if you've got questions. I can see that people are typing right now, so that's good. Hello from Elaine, for example. Okay, great. So you can see that. So when Mairead and I have done this presentation on full cost recovery in real life, it's all centered around the cake. And we were discussing how we can do that when we're all doing Zoom, and clearly you can't eat cake. We actually bribed our participants to give us good marks on the feedback form by bringing cake in real life when we've presented. But I'm afraid all you've got is a picture. But I'd like you to keep this image in mind all the way through. And essentially, if you think of all of your organisational costs as the whole circumference, the whole contents of the cake, and each slice as a project, that is the main metaphor of this session, and I'll explain more as we proceed. So, what is full cost recovery? So this is the definition that can be found in the ACEVO publication. I presume we'll be sharing the presentation afterwards, and our final slide is a list of references, so you don't need to go Googling right now. Just sit back and enjoy. ACEVO stands for the Association of Chief Executives of Voluntary Organisations. They wrote it in conjunction with NPC, which stands for New Philanthropy Capital, and KPMG, which is an accountancy firm, and I'm not sure what that stands for. I think the PM is Pete Marwick, but I think the K and the G are something Dutch. So I couldn't tell you what it stands for. But the definition that they have come up with in their templates for how to do full cost recovery is that it means securing funding for or recovering all of your costs, including direct costs of the projects and all of your overheads. And we'll go into more detail on what constitutes overheads. Every organisation needs to recover all of its costs and ideally generate a surplus, or it cannot do things like pay its employees, rent its office space, and offer its products and services. Or indeed, and we're going to talk about things like governance, plan for the future, and continued development and delivery of services. And I mentioned the cake before. I've split this chart into two parts. So on the left, the right is going to appear in a second, you've got all of the costs of your organisation in the total circle. And then in the centre, you've got your overhead costs. This graphic representation, I would say that central circle is probably bigger than it normally would be. That seems like quite a large percentage of overhead costs, but I think it's just so that it's clear. So the central circle is the overhead costs, and the outer circle represents the direct costs of your organisation. I mentioned the cake before. If you were to have the project as one particular slice, you can see how the overhead costs should still be calculated as part of that slice. But it's important to say that the proportion of overhead to direct costs isn't necessarily the same. So that circle, that inner circle, wouldn't necessarily be in exactly the same place. And that's why when you're calculating your overheads for a particular project, you shouldn't just say, well, it's a certain percentage. You need to show more working than that. So, another definition, this is from the National Lottery Community Fund. And I've got the web link there, and that's also on the final slide of the presentation. Full cost recovery means securing funding for all of the costs involved in running a project. It means that you can request funding for direct project costs and for a proportionate share of your organisation's overheads. So they do support applications that include overheads. I've emboldened the word proportionate. It's not the NLCF who've done that, because I wanted to emphasise that particular word. Over to you, Mairead.
Thank you, Richard. Now, when we've done this training session in person, I like to take this moment to kind of not turn everything on its head, but to pull apart the title, which is full cost recovery, and actually reframe it in terms of full cost awareness, because I think that's actually more so where the greatest challenge is. And from my experience, particularly within a local authority context, understanding what actually you can put within the what can be included as full costs and what can be is actually sometimes the greatest challenge, rather than the recovery of it, because the total recovery is not always possible, and sometimes an ambition rather than a reality. So in terms of the Arts Council's perspective on this, different funders have, as I'm sure you'll have noticed, different interpretations and different restrictions on what they will include and what they will allow for full cost recovery. So for Arts Council England, their repeat projects and ongoing overheads and salaries guidelines say full cost recovery means securing funding for or recovering all your costs, including the direct costs of projects and additional overheads. Can I move on, Richard, or?
Is that the slide you wanted, Mairead?
Yes, that's yeah, and I think it's back over to you, isn't it?
Yes, so we're going to open it to the floor now, and ask you, well, I'm going to stop the presentation briefly and type in your answers. If you could have a little think on your own, just for the moment, on what constitutes direct costs and what constitutes indirect costs. And then we'll go to the floor, facilitated by Mairead, in 10 seconds or so.
Are we allowing people just 10 seconds to, okay, fine. Okay, I'm gonna ask you all to unmute yourselves. Thank you. And anyone have any suggestions as to what might fall under the category of direct costs and what would fall under indirect costs?
Capital costs would be direct costs, wouldn't they? The capital cost of performing something to deliver your grant, whereas indirect would be office and just the normal run-of-the-mill things which you would incur delivering something like this.
Anybody else?
Your direct costs, I suppose, for a project would be, say, project manager, for example. But the indirect costs could be existing admin officer and the sort of proportion of their time spent on that specific project.
Thank you, Helen. That's a really good one. And I know I'm actually really interested in, David, your perspective on this, because it can be quite challenging sometimes within a local authority context to get, you know, kind of get figures for those indirect costs, or even identify what they are.
Yeah, we definitely had a lot of issues when we were developing our facilities management sort of planning for HLF second phase in actually ascertaining those, I guess, primarily indirect costs of keeping the building going when there's not there doesn't seem to be a specific amount that's there for that purpose. And yeah, the HR, IT, all of those different aspects is really difficult to get a handle on.
But if you're doing a project, wouldn't you be factoring all that in when you cost it?
Yeah, it would be good to, but I guess.
I mean, yeah, if it's extra costs that you didn't factor in, I suppose that'd be incorrect, but that would still be classed as direct costs if to deliver the project, you had to take so many different individuals out of your organisation, so many hours for each of them.
It depends.
We're all volunteers, so it's a whole different ball game for us.
Any other suggestions from anybody? No? Richard, I think it's back over to you, to the one you prepared earlier. Richard? Oh.
How's that? You can hear me now. So this I think is what people typed, what people said, and I typed. So we had capital projects and project manager, and then a much longer list, and not surprisingly, of indirect costs. We had a bit more time to think about this, and we had the following as direct costs. So salaries of staff working on the project. So project managers were mentioned, volunteer expenses, marketing costs, venue hire, and materials or capital items that you might need, and capital expenditure was mentioned. So also known as project costs or variable costs. And then for indirect costs, often known as, referred to as overheads or core costs or fixed costs. As discussed, really, heat and light, those kind of things, rent, rate, utilities, IT, telephony, but also salaries of staff working across projects. So working in administration, HR, fundraising, potentially probably managing the people who are doing the direct project, and also legal and audit fees. So that all comes under what? What do we mean by full cost recovery? What do we mean by direct costs and indirect costs? The next question is, why is this important? And over to you again, just to give your thoughts.
Why do people think it's important?
You don't want to be using up any of your own reserves. You want to cover all your costs from funders, don't you? You don't want to put yourself in a position a lot of people have found themselves now when the income stops coming in. You've got very little reserves to survive.
Anybody else?
Well, it's very easy to forget a lot of the indirect costs. So yeah, it's important to think about it.
There's one way indirect costs come in, I suppose you could say. Some of the grants we have gone for, they've been from multiple funders. Some will only cover capital costs, won't cover anything else, and others cover getting consultants in, all that sort of thing. Developing your idea. So in other words, you've got to find somebody that covers every cost. I mean, what I mean is there's indirect costs. If you've got somebody to fund your project, anything doesn't come under what they fund is an indirect cost, isn't it? So then you've got to find out a way to cover that. So that could even be capital costs that are indirect because that funder didn't cover it. Would that be a right way of saying it?
Yeah. Anybody else? What would happen? Sorry. What would happen if organisations didn't cover their overheads when they were bidding for projects?
Oh, well, the way things
I
go.
think it's quite easy. Sorry. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
no.
Ellen? Yeah.
Oh, I think it's very easy for there to be a lot of mission creep in, when you're actually managing a project, for example, that certain elements of it may just take more time. So perhaps there's a volunteer team working on a specific project. If you haven't costed a set amount or proportion or number of days per week, say, for your existing admin staff or manager to actually deal with that project, then it's a question of time management, isn't it? Then other issues, the strategic issues, the forward planning, or the networks or whatever, go to slip. And so it's kind of like it's important to have a handle on that, both in terms of cost and time.
Funders these days that I'm dealing with want to know every figure that you've got now. They want to know how much you've got in reserves, how much is sort of ring fenced, and what's I can't think of the term now, just freely available funds. I mean, I don't think you can get away with anything these days. A few years ago, I think you could, before I really got involved, if people were putting in grants and then not being able to, putting up projects, getting grants and not cover everything. But I think it's very difficult today. They're really scrutinising your funds.
You mean unrestricted and designated funds?
Yeah. You've got to say what a room is, and you've got to prove it now.
I think the main reason for me in terms of fully understanding the costs is that if you don't include all of the costs, then the organisation is subsidising that project. And that's absolutely fine when there's lots of money and there's fat and so on. And in fact, I think funders have worked on the basis that people will only go for the additional stuff. And so there is that level of buy-in from the organisation to a project. But effectively, it is the organisation subsidising the project and removing the need for the funder to fund it all. Now, that's in a way fine if you as an organisation can do that. But certainly as budgets are getting tighter and tighter, people have to really understand what the cost is, because the position of being able to subsidise it might have disappeared.
I couldn't go for anything unless I prove to my treasurer that I've got everything covered. We as an all volunteer group could not afford to come in at a loss. We've never borrowed money, and we've always been in the black, and we want to stay that way. So we don't do anything unless we know we've got everything covered. And that's where inside your own organisation, you should be scrutinising each other to make sure that you don't expose yourself like that.
Thank you. I'll carry on then. That's great. We've got our own version of those answers, and you covered most of them. I particularly like this illustration because we're going to talk a little bit about charities being clear about all of their expenditure when they declare that all of their expenditure goes straight to the cause. I find this amusing because it's a very graphic representation. Clearly, the panda, if you were to give money for pandas, you would need the middle person to actually do something with that money, because the pandas can't do anything with £10. Simply put, a risk for charities at the moment is the cutting out of the middleman, or disintermediation, as I think it's called. Talking of which, over to you, Mairead.
Thank you, Richard. And I think this just draws on the point that Richard was making, but it's a a timely example. I'm not going to go into the details of how much or the political elements of this, but I thought it was, it caught my attention, the story in the Sun calling on Just Giving to give back the percentage of gift aid that they were taking in terms of their, you know, to cover their costs. And following that story, I don't know if any of you have seen, but Virgin Money Giving decided to jump on the opportunity and say that they agreed with it, that no fundraising platform should take a cut, and that they would do it without making a profit. And the reason that I've included it in here, and I think the Small Charities Coalition quote really highlights it, it's a woeful lack of understanding of how charities operate. And I think it really doesn't help in terms of the public message and public imaging of full cost awareness, and it puts people like you in a difficult in a difficult position when fundraising to make the argument to cover the full costs. Thank you, Richard. Oh, I also get the graph of doom. Great, lucky me. I'm not sure if any of you will have seen this. Some of you may have done. It's a little bit out of date, but still relevant. If anything, it should be maybe called the graph of doom and gloom now. This is from Barnet in 2012. I'm not sure exactly who within their council, but somebody looked at the spending for the years ahead on adult social care and children's services and their predicted budget. And as you can see, by 2024, 2025, the spending is above what their predicted budget is. I would imagine now that if anything, the gap would be bigger, and it's useful to bear this in mind within the context of what local authorities are grappling with. I mean, I do also caveat of they've also just been, you know, thrown a whirlwind. But this is what they were working up to before COVID, of the budget and the income not matching. We did have an interesting, rather than leave this all doom and gloom, in one of the sessions we ran in Hampshire, it was interesting to note that somebody in the session noted that they have worked to ensure that they are part of the local authority offer in terms of children's services. So thereby, like within that kind of purple bar chart, they are part of that budget. I'm not sure what the current status of it is, but it's sometimes about looking at it a slightly different way. Thank you, Richard.
That's okay. So this, I won't dwell on this too much, but whenever I talk to charities about their fundraising, I bring this chart along, which was developed 10 years or so ago by ACEVO, the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. And it's a good way of looking at an organisation's income and thinking about risks and whether and how to diversify. So if you take a moment to think about your own organisation and which of these areas you do get income from, I'm not saying you have to get income from all of them, but clearly the more areas you do get income from, the less risk you've got. But equally, if you've only got one grant funder, there's risk there too. So it's all about diversity of income. And in terms of full cost recovery or full cost awareness, it's the central two that we're looking at in particular. So if you're looking for more unrestricted income, to use the term that Kevin was alluding to earlier on, then open market and gift economy may be better bets, but especially for these central two boxes. So working with local authorities, working with grant funders, in particular, full cost recovery and or full cost awareness, especially important. So the next question, which Mairead will facilitate while I do a bit of typing, is very quickly, because time's marching on, a discussion on the benefits of doing full cost recovery in your organisations. And again, we've got some answers ourselves, so don't sweat it too much.
You keep as much by covering your costs of any projects you've got. You keep more money back, so you can plan for more projects in the future. You've got to look at the long-term future in the museum. If you've got a forward plan, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, you've got to understand how much money you need to progress that way. So you've got to work out a budget that will cover it. So the more money you can save as you're going along, the more you got for these projects you got planned down the future. So definitely, I mean, we've got money out of, before this big crash happened, now, out of companies, and that money was for match funding, and we haven't touched it. That's sitting there. That's ring fenced, that magic word, and we've done that, and that's the only way. That it's so easy to slip into using those bits of funds, and if you can't afford to go somewhere, you don't go there. Otherwise, where are you going to be in another 10 years? So full cost recovery is extremely important to cover all your costs.
Elaine. Thanks, Kevin. So
I think it's important because you know the real costs of doing something, and then if you know those costs, you can recognise what else, what you have to give up, what else you could be doing if you wasn't spending that money. If you don't really understand the cost of it, then as an organisation, you can't make that cost benefit calculation.
Yeah. Is there anything else? I'm gonna yeah, move us along, Richard, because we've still got a bit to cover.
Yep. Hold on. Thank you. That's roughly what you said so far. Mairead.
Oh, sorry. The chat is hiding my star. So some of the key benefits, and these have been mentioned, are in protecting reserves, which is even more important at the moment because we don't know how long this will last for. Improved understanding and management of costs, better decision making, more informed. And I think drawing on Elaine's point about improved the understanding and management, having that understanding and there being a clear picture across the organisation of everybody knowing what it is incredibly valuable, so that when projects are proposed, there's a broader understanding of the real costs involved. Ability to compare costs with funding available, promoting funder confidence, justify costs to stakeholders, long-term planning made easier, and ultimately you have a more sustainable organisation. Thank you. The benefit for funders, and I can say this as somebody who used to look at funding bids, makes for consistency and supports assessment and comparison. It was often quite obvious if people hadn't considered their costs. You'd be looking through thinking there's something missing here. Transparent, it reduces the risk of double funding, reduces the risk of fraudulent funding, and supports a sustainable sector. The funders ultimately want your organisations to succeed and continue existing. So it's best to be honest about what those full costs are.
And just very briefly, if we fail to recover costs, and I think it was, I had my view of who was saying what obscured while I was typing. I think it was Elaine who talked about knowing the true cost of things. So if you fail to recover your core costs, you're jeopardizing sustainability, management, public support, innovation. Kevin talks about planning for the future, and ultimately your independence potentially.
Yeah, I think there's an issue just come up now, which is I don't think anybody's probably planned for before. All right, I've only been in doing this for 9 years, my 10th year now, but is some people have got projects in place at the moment, and if they didn't have the full cost, we were always able to go to different funders. All of a sudden, all these funders, these major funders, Historic England, the Lottery, Arts Council, aren't funding. Have put all those different grant systems on hold, and they're putting their money in trying to just make museums survive. So all of a sudden, you don't have this access to the money. It's been delayed now for 6 months, could be even longer. So, it's even more critical now to figure out where all your costs are going, because, if this happened again, you could get caught really short.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of benefits, again, the model provides a basis for calculating costs. It doesn't prescribe specific percentages in terms of overheads. It basically gives you a framework to show you're working. And major funders consider it good practice. I think we should rather than going to the floor again, just kick on if you don't mind, with how you do it. So this is from the ACEVO model that will share with you. But basically, the full cost of an activity is the direct costs of that activity. So all of the things on the left-hand side that we discussed right at the beginning, then a proportionate amount of all of the other costs in your organisation, and the model helps you work out how to calculate those. And clearly we can't do a maths lesson right now, and certainly it's even harder in a Zoom room. But this gives you an idea of the categories that are in the model. So your project A is one of 5 projects here of this organisation, and the A is blocked out in red, so those are the direct costs, and then it's a proportion of those other 4 areas. And then it gets a bit more detailed here, but essentially you've got your premises, you work out your total direct cost of your project, which is the red box, and then you calculate the overhead costs for the organisation as a whole. So those are all of the other colours, the blue, the yellow, the purple, I think it is, and green. So that could be your premises and office costs, could be your director, support services, governance and strategic development, and general fundraising. And you allocate the premises and office costs to those on the right, and then work out how much of that you need to apportion on top to your project, and that can be in a range of that you can calculate that apportionment in a range of ways. Very, very simply, for example, back in my days working at Museums, Libraries, Archives, London region, we worked out that apportionment based on the head count. So the number of people who would be working on that project. So we were applying for funding for a particular piece of work working in libraries across London. We knew there would be 4 people working on that programme, and that was 4 out of a total of, say, 25 people in the organisation. So that is, I've chosen an example that I can work out fairly quickly, that 16% of those other costs needed to be added onto the project. But the most important thing of all was that we've worked out those total costs and given a proper rationale for how we were apportioning them to the project. But it doesn't have to be just by headcount, it could be other ways of calculating it too. So the most important thing is to show you're working how you calculated that apportionment. This actually is a quotation from the Heritage Fund themselves. You'll need to show us how you've calculated your costs based on recent published accounts. You will then need to tell us on what basis you've allocated a share of the cost of the project you're asking us to fund, and we will assess whether this is fair and reasonable. And so that basically speaks to the chart I was showing you earlier. You need to be able to show, based on the figures that you've got in your accounts, so how much all of those things cost, and actually show how you've apportioned it. Mairead.
Sorry, so just as an example, Richard, if you were to ask for overhead costs that were 50% of your project budget, I mean, it's not to say that that's not possible, it's just showing how you came to that particular figure. You might want to check as an organisation whether it's worth running a project like that, but right, Sonia has to go at 3 o'clock. I'm going to, yeah.
Nearly there, I think.
Yeah. So the barriers. Which slides, yeah. So some of the key barriers to to go back to the point that I made about it being about full cost awareness, as opposed to recovering all the costs, because the first thing is, understanding what are they. It's lack of time, ability and skills, lack of time to go to find the right person and who actually has the numbers. Perception of what funders will allow and will not allow. Getting clarity within and across the whole organisation, in that it's not just the accountant's job. Next one, Richard. So full costs and funders, as I just highlighted, it depends. I think, David, you highlighted this, the lottery fund are not that keen on funding, on covering costs for local authorities, and I don't think that has changed. Somebody please correct me if I'm wrong, but their guidance highlights that if you're an organisation in the voluntary sector, they'll cover a proportion of your organisation's overheads, which must be appropriate to the time and resources used for your project. We can also cover a proportion of the cost of an existing staff member, as long as they are not working exclusively on the funded project. We expect this contribution to be calculated using full cost recovery. By voluntary sector, we mean organisations that are independent of government and whose governance, finance and resources have a voluntary focus. For example, a voluntary sector organisation might have a board of trustees, be funded by grants and donations, and rely upon volunteers to carry out their aims. We cannot accept applications that include full cost recovery from public sector organisations. For example, government funded museums, local authorities or universities. Recognised guidance on calculating the full cost recovery amount is available from National Lottery Community Fund. And you'll need, as Richard has highlighted, to show how you've calculated your costs on based on recent accounts. You're rushing me through, Richard, sorry. But I just wanted to say, for some of you, that's still quite relevant. I know for particularly Kevin and Valerie, you fall with under that category of voluntary organisations. David, not so much. And sorry, Claire, I'm not sure how where you might fit within that. In terms of the Arts Council, they have, as far as I am aware, they haven't changed on this. They don't have the same restrictions, basically. And full cost recovery means securing funding or recovering all your costs, including direct costs of projects and additional overheads. And they refer to the ACEVO guidance on full cost recovery. So while there's slightly differing perspectives on it, the point that Richard was making about showing your workings, I think, applies to both. Thank you, Richard. That's as fast as I could get through that. Oh, it's me again. Other things to consider, full cost recovery is a way to understand the true cost, but you can't always get it from your funder. Build in inflation, including pay rises for staff year on year. Interesting to see how that will work out next year. Capital costs, do they make sense in the context of the project? And ensure that your budget really aligns with your project delivery. Does it make sense? And the other thing, and so often I don't see this, is do you need to budget any contingency, and how can you justify this?
So we put it in the time roughly.
That's a whistle-stop tour.
Whistle-stop tour. So we did start slightly late, so I'll let us off, and we had interaction during rather than at the very end. But I don't know how you're fixed with childcare, Mairead, but I could certainly spare another 10 minutes if there are questions. And when the presentation is shared, you'll see all the references, which is the final slide there, that you can go to get more information about full cost recovery. But does anybody have questions for me or Mairead, or indeed anyone else? I think Kevin does.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to that last section there, and it's made me think a lot about different grants we've produced, or, you know, gone for and got. And you've got to set out the cost, all the costs involved in that project. And to simplify that, just say there's one cost. I got to go to a contractor, I get his cost. But us as an all volunteer, I then got all my phone calls, my running around the car, going down to check at the museum. I haven't really seen any funder that would allow me to put those costs in. And I can't put them in on that person, that contractor that I've got. He's covered it in his costs, but I can't put my costs into him. So I will be out of pocket, and there's no way I can get that money back. So, I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Which I don't know what your perspective on this is, but there's, you know, there's the governance and management costs can be covered, and I have seen, you know, it being covered for projects. Well,
we had a big one with Historic England, and we couldn't put that down in there. All out. We can put in our time. We can put in our time as volunteer time, and that's, you know, added in. That's fair enough. But other things like photocopying and all that, and telephone calls, I haven't really seen, unless I'm missing something, and I should have included it indirectly somehow. I don't know.
And it does depend on the funder, but what I've done in a variety of places is effectively have a rate sheet for every member of staff, and that includes the director, and worked out how much of their time will be spent managing the project or managing the person who's managing the project, because without that, it may as well be a separate organisation. It's going to be so much more effective if, as part of your organisation, it wouldn't exist otherwise. And so I've worked out that the director's time is costs X per hour.
Yeah.
And put it accordingly in the management costs, the direct management costs of the project, or the level just directly above that.
I think
that is accepted by some funders.
Yeah, I think, Kevin, am I right in thinking it's the lottery that you're specifically?
Well, I've had historic in the lottery.
Okay.
I'm trying to think. Architectural Heritage Fund.
A lot of people do end up putting in more time.
Well, they ask you how you on some of those. They have a specific rate per hour for an experienced person, and so much for just a helper sort of thing. And it just sounds like to me that you got to put a couple of extra hours, and it'll cover these other costs. Be the only way you could do it, really. I don't know. It's just a thought. I mean, I might be, asking a silly question. I don't know.
I suppose if you have a policy to pay your volunteers' expenses, then that is an identifiable budget that you could then calculate part of for a project.
No, we don't pay them, I think, but we do claim money for their time, which I suppose will cover any of their expenses then, wouldn't it?
I mean, I have seen, there's a project that comes to mind where the director, it was, I mean, I'm not doubting they were spending a very long time on it, but it was working out at about 10 hours a day. No, yeah. Which, then as a funder, you go, well, is that a great use of that time? And so it goes back to Richard's point about being proportionate and reasonable. Nobody's going to doubt how much time people are contributing, how much of that is volunteer time. It's about recognizing that there is that amount of time being spent and asking, proportionately.
Thank you, Mairead, and thank you, Kevin. David, Claire, Valerie, any other questions?
No, not at the moment from me. I think I've just got to process everything, but yeah, very interesting.
There's lots to take in. What was difficult to get across is how passionate Mairead and I are about this. It's quite a hobby horse, but there's lots of information we were trying to squeeze into an hour.
It's great.
Thanks, Claire.
We shall invite you back in more normal times for a longer session on this.
Are you just saying that because you'd like some cake?
Yeah, exactly.
I think the only other thing, and before, if nobody else has any questions, is and again, David, sorry, I'm going to pull on you, is within a local authority context, getting those numbers and speaking to the right people to get the figures. I appreciate can be a challenge in itself, but worthwhile, definitely worthwhile. And even though the lottery have taken the position of not covering those costs, I think part of, maybe this is wishful thinking, but I think their understanding of what the costs are within a local authority context, they don't have that information. So being able to have that, kind of as research almost, this is actually what it is, will only help in future funding applications.
Yeah, I think for me, it does change. So, as much detail as you get in the first instance as to how much time different departments are putting in things. Since we've been through the project, it started off with probably 2 members of staff involved with it. And then over the years, it's probably grown to, you've got 2 or 3 people from planning, you've got a head of service, you've got additional project managers that are, as something grows and people realise what is actually involved, and that becomes quite difficult to then actually stop and reflect and think about putting those costs into any sort of funding bids. So yeah, I think it's going to be easier when things settle down and we're getting towards the end of the project, and then it's a sort of an ongoing running costs and project costs going forwards. But at the moment, it's very difficult to understand. Someone else might have those figures in mind, but I don't at the moment. So.
Great. I think are we okay to draw it to a conclusion? But on the presentation, you've got our email addresses on the final slide. So do contact us if you would like to, and also engage with us on Twitter if that would be helpful.